Okay, let's continue on with chapter 33 and start talking about the animals. Like I said, what I'd like to do is go back to the nematodes, which we skipped the other day for the purposes of having the information that I wanted you to know for lab. So let's do the nematodes, and then we'll jump back over and finish up the rest of the arthropods. Nematodes are down there on the bottom of that chart. Remember, the nematodes and the arthropods fit into that group we call the ectozoa, and that specifically refers to the fact of organisms who molt. Right? Ecdysis is the molting, is the loss of the external exoskeleton. And while we're pretty familiar with that when it comes to things like insects and all that, you might not realize that there are other critters out there that aren't insects or aren't arthropods that actually undergo this molting process as well. And the other one that we're talking about is the nematodes. You remember I said very early on in this discussion of animals, one of the things that we did, and actually we've been talking about this since the beginning of the semester to some degree as well. Many times we would lump animals together in groups simply because of the way they looked. And the nematodes were one of those. The nematodes used to be lumped in with all the worm-looking things like the platyhelminthes, the segmented worms that we talked about, simply because they all look like worms. Well, we all know by now, with all the discussion we've had this semester, that just because you look alike doesn't necessarily mean you're related, right? It's that whole idea of convergent evolution. So just because annelids and nematodes and flatworms all kind of have a similar appearance, once again, they're not necessarily mean they're closely related. So let's take a look at nematodes. Nematodes are found pretty much everywhere. They're marine, freshwater, they're found in soil. They're actually an important part of agriculture. They help aerate soil. They help recycle nutrients. There are parasitic forms, and that's also a problem in agriculture. A lot of these nematodes, if you look in the lower right down here, there we go, right down there, that's a plant root, and the little red or purple things all over it are the nematodes. So nematodes can be parasitic on plants. It can also be parasitic on animals. And as a matter of fact, the largest nematode, the largest one on record, is a parasite that parasitizes sperm whale placentas, growing up to 8 to 9 meters long. That's a huge nematode, right? A lot of marine mammals, cetaceans and whales, that sort of stuff, many times, or I guess I could almost say probably every time, the young that are born out in the wild oftentimes already have a parasite load. They oftentimes already have parasites. That's because a lot of parasites, including nematodes, can actually move through the placental interface. So they can actually move across from the mother, which was the original host, into the offspring. So offspring are born already with these parasites. Now, one of the biggest things that you'll notice, yeah, no kidding, being born that way, huh? One of the biggest things you'll notice about this worm compared to some of the other ones we looked at was the fact that it's not segmented. Remember, the annelid was segmented. And segmentation is a characteristic that we said was important and prominent among animals, but we don't find it in this group. Basically, nematodes are a real simple body plan, especially in the worm that you see here in the picture and the one in the lower left. This is Ascaris. This is the nematode Ascaris. Basically, what we say is there are a tube within a tube body plan. So if we took a cross-section of one of these, it's really nothing more than a digestive system tube inside of a tube that is the outer body. That digestive system is the alimentary canal. That's what it says there on the slide. That's the digestive system. No circulatory system, right? So they're going to live by diffusion. A flexible but rigid and protective cuticle that they have to get rid of. The cuticle on the outside, they have to get rid of through ecdysis in order for these organisms to grow. So if we were to take a look at the inside of a typical Ascaris, either male or female, there's basically two things inside these organisms. There's the tube within the tube, right? There's the alimentary canal, and then there's reproductive organs. That's about all they are, which is something that we, remember in the tapeworm. Tapeworm didn't even have a way to feed. Tapeworms absorb their food through, diffusion or through, absorption into through their skin. A lot of times parasites become very simple, and sometimes in the case of the tapeworm, they lose their ability to feed. Or in the case of the nematode, they have a very simple digestive system. There's no need to mash things up. There's really no need to do any digesting. Most of it's already digested. You're living in the gut of a host. And so what you're basically doing is just kind of sucking up that digested material. And of course, reproduction is important. So as I said, the two big things you'll find in there are the digestive tract and then the reproductive organs. There is sexual dimorphism in Ascaris. We have males and females, and they're distinctly different. The females tend to be larger. Not only longer, they also tend to be a little thicker. And the males are much thinner and smaller, and more distinctively, the males always have this little hook at the end. So if you come across a nematode, now you know male or female. This includes things called roundworms, eel worms, which really aren't eels. Eels are fish. And then things called vinegar eels. Again, not eels, but you see the picture there of the jar of vinegar. These organisms can live in vinegar. Now, that's kind of interesting in its own right? Considering vinegar is an acid. But these organisms have survived a way to be able to do that. And if you think about it, they can live in the acid of vinegar. They could probably live in the acid of your stomach, as well as some of the harsh conditions you might find inside of a host. Parasitism is a good life if you can get it, right? Don't really have to do a lot of work. Nematodes affect human beings, obviously, not just plants and other animals. There are about 50 species that are pathological to human beings. The worm on the right, the trigonosus worm, gets into the musculature of animals and actually encysts. It creates these circles that you see down below, these encysted, and of course, that damages the muscle tissue and causes problems to the host. The disease here being called trichinella. You get trichinella from eating organisms that already have the trichinosis, already have the trichinella worm encysted in the musculature. That's why it says it comes from eating undercooked meats, wild game or pork. If you cook it, of course, these worms are killed and there's no problem. But it's the consuming of raw that can cause you to take on trichinosis. I know my father growing up was he was a rancher, and of course he'd been around pigs and cows and all that. He was adamant that pork in my house was always cooked quite well, and pork's not one of those things you're supposed to cook really well, but my dad always insisted that it be cooked really well because of the incidences of trichinosis. I don't know if it needs to be cooked as far as my dad cooked it, but none of us ever got trichinosis. Okay, pinworms. Any of you ever have pinworms out there? Harrison, did you ever have pinworms? Dustin? Kaylee, anybody ever have pinworms? Isaac, did you ever have pinworms? 30% of kids in the United States get pinworms, so don't be shy. You would have them as a child for the most part. Let's take a look on the right-hand side. Look at let's start with number 2 at the top. So the embryonated eggs are ingested by the humans. So the eggs are in the environment. This is why it's typically or so common in children. 30% of the kids in the U.S. have it, because young kids are notorious for putting all kinds of things in their mouth, right? Dirt and all sorts of stuff. So if they're out in the environment and ingested one of these worms, the worm enters into the digestive system. In the small intestines, it hatches into a larval form, and then as it moves into the cecum, into the large intestines, that larval form matures and eventually ends up creating, and there's sexual dimorphism in these worms too, the males and the females, and they live in the lumen, the opening. The lumen is the inside opening of the intestines. Lumen is the inside opening of anything that's a pipe. And then the gravid females that are pregnant, will then move out at night. Usually what they do is they'll come out and they'll lay their eggs around the paraanal region, so around the anus. And then the eggs that are on the paraanal folds, the larvae inside the eggs mature, and then either the eggs or the larvae fall off and can be transmitted to another host. The itching, the anal itching, which is symptomatic of pinworms, and oftentimes how doctors can or suspect that children who have it, comes about from the females at night when they come out to lay their eggs. That causes a minor irritation, and it causes you to have an itchy butt. Not a big deal to get rid of. As I said, 30% of the children have it. It's easily controlled. It's probably not the most pleasant thing in the world to think about, worms living inside of you, but it's not something that's going to cause death. certainly not if it's properly treated. The roundworms that we looked at before, the Ascaris lumbricoides, they affect about 1/6 of the world population, typically related to sanitation issues in areas in which sanitation is not as good. Now, these worms can be they can be problematic. If you look here, this is an X-ray of a woman who was complaining of gastro discomfort, and when they X-rayed, they found all the white that's glowing there is the mass of worms that are living in her gut. So she had a whole bunch of roundworms. If you ever worked in a vet, dogs can get roundworms, cats can get roundworms. Oftentimes, if a dog has worms, you can see it in the fecal material. The feces will be dropped, and you look in there, you see little white worms wiggling about. Those would be roundworms. Again, something that's relatively easy to treat, but like this person in the X-ray, you certainly don't want it to go. You don't want it to go too far unless your intestines impacted like that. I don't know, man. I tell you, I guess if I went there and the doctor showed me my X-ray and said you're full of worms, I said just shoot me. Holy cow! That would just be. It's kind of like that show we were talking about the other day, right? The monsters inside me. Now, here's a worm that particularly can cause some problems. We've heard of the condition. Well, it's mispronounced quite a bit as elephantitis. It's not elephantitis. It's elephantiasis. And elephantiasis is a tropical disease caused by a filarial worm or filariasis worm. Specifically, this worm that causes elephantiasis, the one down here, is known, the scientific name is Wucheria bancrofti. Now, what this worm does is it gets into the bodies and it migrates and it begins to reproduce and set up residency, if you will, in the lymphatic system of its host. You remember I said you had lymph nodes scattered throughout your body, you have some in your neck, and they're responsible for, they're part of your immune system. You have ones in your chest region. You also have some in your groin. You have some lymph nodes in your groin. And basically what the lymph nodes do, they're part of your immune system, but basically what they do is they drain the fluid back from the extremities, the legs and the arms and such, back to the heart. Well, these filarial worms get into the lymphatic system and they migrate. And when they find a lymph node, they basically will hang on that lymph node and start reproducing and growing. And they get so big, and there's so many of them, they actually start to block up the lymphatic system. So you see that picture of the guy with his leg there. What has happened is that lymph node up near his groin area, right about in here, has been is now full of these filariasis elephantiasis worms, and the edema, the collection of fluid that you see in his leg, is a result of basically nothing more than just a blockage. That can be problematic, obviously. And you can have that in arms or legs or both legs. I saw someone with elephantiasis when I was in the when I was in the Navy. I was in Sri Lanka, and there was a beggar on the side of the road, obviously a homeless person on the side of the road who had elephantiasis in both the legs. Now, there's also a story about a chief in New Guinea, one of the local tribes, who had elephantiasis that affected him in the groin region, but didn't cause edema in his legs. It caused edema in his scrotum. His scrotum reportedly got so large that in order for him to get around, he had to carry it in a wheelbarrow. I guess maybe that's why he was chief, huh? Like, why are you chief? Well, do you carry your scrotum around in a wheelbarrow? It's kind of interesting. I'm not sure how attractive that would be, but nonetheless. Makes it kind of hard to sit down, I would think, too. Excuse me, let me move my scrotum out of the way. All right, any questions about nematodes? I always remember nematodes are roundworms. I don't confuse me other ones because there's an O in the word. Nematode, roundworms. All right, let's get back into the arthropods. So we went through this. Segmentation is important. We talked about characteristics. We talked about some of their sense organs, their eyes, and I think this was the last slide. Somebody give me a yay or a nay on that. Was that the last slide? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, good. Any questions on this slide before we go on? So compound eyes, great for motion, not so good for detail. Okay, the respiratory system. If you're a marine arthropod, you use gills. If you live in the ocean, gills tend to be the respiratory organ of choice. They tend to do the best job. If you're tinier, like we talked before in terms of the mosses, you can use a diffusion. But terrestrial arthropods have these things called trachea. Very, same spelling, same idea as the trachea in your neck. The part that delivers the air down into your lungs. So on the sides of their bodies, they'll have these little holes, these little spiracles, and the spiracles open up into a trachea, and then these trachea get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, what this does is this is how air or gas is exchanged. And this is one of the things that makes insects so doggone successful out on land, is because, now remember, they have an open circulatory system, so that's going to affect their metabolic rates. But what happens with these tracheals is they get so small that there's no cell in the organism's body that's so far away from a tracheal that diffusion won't supply it with its needs to move materials around. Remember I said if you're small, you can use diffusion through your skin. Well, grasshoppers aren't small, but what they've done is kind of set it up in such a way so that no cells in there are so far away that they can't take advantage of the physical process of diffusion. This allows these organisms, as I said, this leads a lot to their success. These allow these organisms to do very well on land, right? Because they have higher metabolic rates, and especially among those jumpers and flying organisms, you need a really high metabolic rate to do that. So that's good for living on land. But remember, one of the problems with living on land is drying out. And just like the stomata in a plant, the spiracles can also lose water. But if you notice in the red that I put in the picture on the right, they actually have valves by which they can open and close to control the water loss. Spiders have things called book lungs. A similar sort of structure appears in Limulus. Limulus is the horseshoe crab. The genus for horseshoe crab, and they have what we call book gills. Book gills and book lungs, obviously this is the gill material right here, or the respiratory exchange material, are called that because it looks like, I don't know, I guess like pages of a book. All right. Okay, any questions on that? All right, excretory system. Again, diffusion works well. If you're aquatic, you can actually get rid of waste products through your gills as well as gas exchange. A lot of fish use their gills to get rid of excretory material. Terrestrial insects, right, not living in the water, they have a little different circumstances to deal with. They use these things called Malpighian tubules. I'm sure the word Malpighian must come from some fellow who discovered them or described them. But if we look in the digestive tract of a grasshopper, this is the digestive system, right, moving towards the rectum. Obviously, the large stuff in there is fecal material, from the food they've eaten. The Malpighian tubules are these little yellow tubes that are sticking out. And what happens there, salt, water, and nitrogenous waste diffuses into the Malpighian tubules, mixes with the fecal materials, it's making its way down towards the rectum. Now, right before it leaves the body, right before it leaves the rectum and is expelled to the outside, notice what happens, reabsorption. All right, so Malpighian tubules filter out everything, including the nitrogenous waste, and then later on reabsorb the salt in the water, leaving just behind the nitrogenous waste. Your kidneys do something relatively similar to that as well. Your kidneys go through a process by which they filter out water, and then later on in the process of your kidneys, the water actually absorbs back into your body. This whole process here of making this very concentrated nitrogenous waste, uric acid or guanine, is very efficient at conserving water, which is something that would be a good land adaptation, something that would be necessary. Okay, so now let's start looking at different groups of arthropods, and let's start with everybody's favorites. Let's start with the chelicerates. Now, the chelicerates are, in terms of what you've been looking in the lab, you're looking at for the lab organisms you need to know. Specifically, you need to know the arachnids, right? And the chelicerates include the arachnids. The chelicerates are called that because they have fangs or pinchers, which are called chelicerate, right? Which, again, is nothing more than a modified appendage. Everything in arthropods, all about modified appendages. Oftentimes, chelicerates have a cephalothorax and an abdomen. So in our golden orb weaver, there's the cephalothorax, there's the abdomen. That's the banana spider, the garden spider that we have around here. It's called a golden orb weaver. An orb is a web, and you can see in this picture why it's called a golden orb weaver. You get the light just right. You can see there's a kind of goldish in color. Really pretty cool. This is the spiders and the ticks. The bark scorpion, which we have here in Florida. We have a bark scorpion. I used to see them a lot at when I taught over at Seminole State College. At night, when I would come out from teaching night classes, the lights in the parking lot would be on, and it would attract a lot of insects, you know. And of course, attract a lot of insects, then you attract a lot of things that would eat insects, toads, frogs, and spiders and scorpions. So I see a lot of scorpions out there. The horseshoe crabs that we talked about, sea spiders, which are only found in the ocean. So there is a spider. Here's actually a marine version. The daddy longlegs. The reason why we consider daddy longlegs not a true spider, and again, this is it's a technicality kind of thing, is spiders have two parts to their body, right? They have the cephalothorax and the abdomen, but in the harvestman, which is another name for a daddy longlegs, there's only one body part. So they've taken that fusion of segments and then that fusion of larger and larger segments. Remember, we call them tagmata when you start to fuse the segments together, and they fused them all into one giant segment there. Again, is a harvestman a spider? Well, yes, but if you were talking to an arachnologist, they would say that it's not a true spider. And of course, we can't leave the chelicerates unless we talked about our buddy, the red bug, the chiggers. Anybody ever had chiggers? No, we don't want to forget the chigger. That's what they look like when they crawl up your leg. What they do is the adults get up there, the females, and they'll actually lay their eggs on your skin. The eggs then burrow down below your skin, and as the eggs hatch into larval form, the larvae have to feed, obviously, right? And the way they feed is they secrete a liquid or a substance, I don't know if it's a liquid, that actually liquefies your skin cells. And then they suck up those liquefied skin cells. That's their food. The red itching that you feel from all of that is the result of that material that they secrete to liquefy your skin cells. It's kind of like the itching that we talked about you get from a mosquito. I live right down the road in Orlando from Red Bug Lake Road. You can imagine why it's called Red Bug Lake. Of course, any place you go in Florida, you're going to find red bugs. I was messing around the field trip last year and we went to South Pine Lakes Preserve, and we found a place where a bear had laid down for the night. You could see the grass was pushed over. So I laid down just to be stupid, I guess, just to be funny. And got back up a couple of days later. I was covered in chiggers everywhere. But I'll live. I've probably been bitten by chiggers more times than I can even count. Okay, the arachnids is the most famous and the biggest group that we find in the chelicerates, and those are the spiders with 6 pairs of appendages. The chelicerae are the attacking fangs. The pedipalps. Now, here's another example of what they've done with appendages. A pedipalp, which is in the front right there, is a modified appendage. It's a sensing appendage. It actually has taste buds on it. So they can use that pedipalp. You can see the picture of the male one up there. They can use that pedipalp to actually sense their environment, sort of like sticking their tongue on things. 6 pairs of appendages, 4 pairs of walking legs, the 6th pair being the pedipalps. Book lungs, like we talked about. Some are orb weavers, and if they are orb weavers, back here they'll have something called spinnerets. And spinnerets are what produces the silk that they use to make their webs out of. Now, all spiders have poison glands. Not all spiders are orb weavers, but other spiders actively hunt, so they don't make a web expecting something to fly into. They go out and try to find it. Oh, and of course, you know, in Florida, we have all of these. We have black widows. Used to see a bunch of black widows up in the lights. In Valencia, they have these outdoor lights, and there always be black widows hanging around up in there. Black widows are neurotoxic. So if you get bit by a black widow, it's similar to being bitten by a coral snake or a cobra. We don't have cobras, but it affects your ability to breathe, basically. And a brown recluse is hemotoxic, which is kind of like a rattlesnake. So this is the bite down below of a brown recluse. What hemotoxic venom does is it basically causes your tissue to become necrotic. It rots your tissue. That's the black that you see there in that guy's, what's that, a thumb or a toe? Yeah, that's all black tissue. That get all that cleaned out. Dog ticks, very common, right? Usually much small, very small until they get a blood meal. Then they've blown up really, really big by that point. Deer ticks, which cause Lyme disease. We don't have a big problem with Lyme disease down here in Florida. We have deer ticks. The actual Lyme disease doesn't come from the tick. It comes from a protozoan parasite. The tick is the vector. But as I said, we don't really have a big issue with deer tick and Lyme disease down here. It's more a matter up in the Midwest. Not quite as much problem down here in the South. I think that's supposed to be hemotoxic. Any other questions about spiders? You guys like spiders? Cool critters, though. I got a tick on me a number of years ago. I had been out in the woods on a Saturday, and I woke up early Sunday morning, and my wife wasn't up yet, and I was in front of the computer reading the news, and I reached around my back. I felt something, and I felt a lump. I don't have a mole there. So I walked into the bathroom, and I noticed that I had an engorged tick. He'd been feeding on me all night long, and he was full of blood. Well, if you're pulling a tick out, it's very important to get the whole body out. You don't want to leave the head behind because it become abscessed inside. So I had to actually get I had to actually try to convince my wife to pull the tick off. Now, my wife is not a woodsy person whatsoever, so she was kind of freaked out. Oh my God, we gotta take you to the doctor. And I'm like, going to the doctor to have a tick removed. I was able to coach her into doing it, how to remove it, but she wasn't happy about it. But nonetheless, they're no big deal. As long as I even have a little tick puller now that works great. It's sort of like this little device you get under the head and you can twist it, pulls them out head and all. So it's good for myself as well as my dog Cooper. He gets ticks quite a bit too. We're always heading out to the woods. I always say that you haven't really been out in the woods and lived until you've gotten a few parasites on you. All right, so that'll do the chelicerates, the arachnids, and all that. Let's do the myriapods next. Remember I told you in lab when we were looking at the different groups of arthropods, I said, okay, you got to know the arachnids, you had to know the insects, the crustaceans, and you had to know the myriapods. And I said a way to remember who the myriapods were is remember what the word myriad means. Myriad means a lot. Myriapods have lots of legs or lots of feet. So these are the centipedes and the millipedes. Basically what it is in both of these organisms, it's a head region that's followed by numerous segments. Very good example of segmentation, right? And basically the way they grow is they just keep adding segments. So small millipedes, like that ivory millipede at the top, would actually look like that, but with fewer segments. As it got older, it would add more segments. Let me see, what did you say, Dustin? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'll bet. Heck yeah, man. You don't want that. If that tissue becomes necrotic, becomes abscess, that can cause a systemic infection. That's definitely something you want to avoid. Yeah, we had a guy at SeaWorld that got bit by a brown recluse. As a matter of fact, he comes and shows it to me, comes back to my office, and he says it was on his upper thigh, and he showed me, he goes, what do you think this is? And I said, oh, my God. I said, that's a brown recluse. So he went and got treatment for it, but didn't realize it. Yeah, it does spread fast, too. It's very quick. Myriapods are gonorchid, which means they have male and female. So it's like being dioecious. Internal fertilization, being terrestrial, that makes sense to have internal fertilization. And the two groups, as I said, are the centipedes and the millipedes. Now, the centipedes have fewer legs. I'm not saying that they have 100, basically one leg per segment, one pair of legs. And the millipedes have more. I'm not saying they have 1,000, but they have 2 pairs of appendages per segment, which is really the result of just 2 segments that fused. Notice the centipedes. They're carnivorous. They have these poisonous fangs or claws, whereas the millipedes, they're herbivorous. And of course, if you're a herbivore, you know, it's easy for other things to eat you, as a herbivore. You're usually not a fighter, if you will. Herbivores are known for runners or being camouflaged. But the way these herbivores, these millipedes, deal with it is they have this offensive smell that comes from these paired glands that you find in each segment that hopefully dissuades the predator. Some species actually producing cyanide gas, which is obviously pretty nasty stuff. So interesting adaptations of animals in order to get their normal predator not to eat them. Okay, let's look at the pancrustaceans. Now, in your book, you break the pancrustaceans down into the crustacean group, like the lobsters and the crayfish we did, the insects and the remipedians, it's a crustacean group, but we don't know exactly where it fits, so that's why you got the dashed lines there. Let's do the other crustaceans first, and then we'll go in and talk about the insects. Crustaceans, most all crustaceans are marine. There are some freshwater. Copepods are freshwater. 3 pairs of appendages that have been modified for chewing, and various pairs of legs. Gills, or if you're smaller, you can diffuse across your cuticle. They're gonorchid, so males and females. And you remember I said early in the semester, organisms that have similar larval or similar embryonic development, or have similar larval stages, or the same larval stage, no matter what they look like as adults, that's usually a really slam dunk indicator of a close relationship, of a close phylogenetic relationship. In other words, they're closely related to one another. Now, the Nauplius larvae, this is the Nauplius larvae. This is actually a picture of a Nauplius larvae, and then the other one's a drawing. The Nauplius larvae is common for all members of this crustacean group. So this is obviously indicates for all the differences, the crabs, the shrimps, the lobsters, the barnacles, the crayfish, all that sort of stuff, the sand fleas, the krill, which is a little shrimp, very important food source, all of them have that Nauplius larval stage. Now y'all recognize those, right? What do we call those? As kids, what do we call those bugs? Yeah, roly-polies. Yeah, there are sea roaches, Dustin. They look like that, but these are the little tiny bugs. Yeah, roly-polies, right? You mess with them and roll up in a ball. And many times they're called pill bugs, too. They're not a bug. They're not an insect. They're actually a crustacean. They're one of the few terrestrial crustaceans. So now something you played with all your life that you thought was a bug, now you learn it's not. It's more closely related to a lobster or shrimp than it is to all the other bugs that we played with. Learn something new every day. Now, among this crustacean group, there are those who have 10 pairs or 10 feet, 5 pairs of thoracic appendages. These are the decapods, and this is the lobster and the crab. 5 pairs of thoracic appendages, okay? 4 walking legs, and then the last one, which is a modified appendage, is the cheliped, the pincher. Remember, we're not going to call it a pincher. We're going to call it by its technical name, the cheliped. So 5 pairs of thoracic appendages, so a total of 10 feet. Exoskeleton, typically made of calcium carbonate, a very common substance in the ocean for structure. It's what makes remember the outside of the coral, that's what their houses are made of, is calcium carbonate. Where else? The mollusks, Remember, the shells of the mollusks are made of calcium carbonate. It's a very common substance used by marine organisms. Segmentation, of course, sometimes combination of segmentation into what we call those tagmata. Remember those functional groups like the cephalon and the thorax? That's called the cephalothorax. And of course, the abdomen. The carapace, the other day in lab when you were cutting with the crayfish, when you're cutting off that shell part, when you're cutting or following those sutures and you pull it off and then all the internal organs were there and all the gills, that part you pulled off, that exoskeleton part is called, technically, it's called a carapace. Carapace is shell. Sea turtles, it's also called a carapace. All right, so it's not indicative just of one group of organisms. So the swimmerets, using for swimming as well as reproduction. Remember I showed you the picture of the gravid one, the gravid female. She holds all her eggs on the swimmeret. Now, blue crabs, over on the right. Blue crabs have sexual dimorphism in their abdomen. The crab carapace, if you take a look at it, is broader than the lobster one. And if you look at the difference between the two, like for example in the lobster and the shrimp, the abdominal part of the carapace is much reduced to the, just this part here. But it's much wider in the crabs. And in blue crabs, it's sexually dimorphic. Females have a wider abdominal region, whereas the males, you can see it's that little spit that kind of goes up towards the front. The females have that wider abdomen because they carry their eggs on their abdomen. So that's why it's that way. So we got sexual dimorphism. What we looked at, sexual dimorphism in worms today, sexual dimorphism in crabs. We learned about sexual dimorphism in crayfish. We're learning all about the boys and the girls, aren't we? Shrimps, lobsters, crabs, crayfish all fit in this group. Another crustacean, not a decapod, but another crustacean is this thing. They're called barnacles. Barnacles are shelled animals. Then why aren't they mollusks? Well, they're not mollusks because if you look at the appendages that are coming out, they're filter feeders. That's what these things that are sticking out the top, they capture their food. But if you look at them closely, these are actually jointed appendages, which is indicative of the group Arthropoda. So the shell in the barnacles, even though you might be inclined to think of it as being a mollusk, the shell is not indicative of what group it's in. It's indicative of that thing we've been saying all along about organisms that look similar but come from different backgrounds. What was that term we used to refer to organisms like the barnacle that has a shell like a mollusk but is not a mollusk? Y'all remember that term? It wasn't that long ago. There you go. Now, the adults of the barnacles are sessile. The larvae can drift, but the adults are sessile. Very, very strong barnacle glue. That's one of those glues they're really interested in because it glues underwater or glues in water. The feathery pandas, like I said, catch food. They are hermaphrodites. Okay, look at the barnacle larvae that you see there. That's the Nauplius larvae again, right? So they are hermaphrodites. So they have male and female sex organs, but remember, we want to avoid that kind of stuff because that would lead to inbreeding. But it's a sessile critter. So how do the male gametes and the female gametes get together? Well, one of the options is kind of like what the sea urchins do, and basically they just kind of spew their gametes out into the water and hopefully they mix. Of course, most of them don't, and then predators come along and feed upon them. So while that works, you're going to have to play the numbers game with that. Well, you might be surprised to find out that pound for pound or inch for inch, I'm not sure how to say it, but barnacles have the largest penis of any organism in the world. That's a barnacle penis. So instead of shedding their gametes out into the wild and being sessile, not being able to move, that male barnacle just has a very long reach with his penis, and you can reach over to that female on the other side a little bit further away and deposit his sperm. All kinds of good information today, huh? Who has the biggest penis in the world? Now we know the biggest organism is a mushroom, and we know the biggest penis, relatively speaking for scale, is a barnacle. Fascinating. All right, let's take a look at this insect group. Oh my goodness, 6 legs as opposed to 10, so that's why we call them hexapods. 30 orders. A huge number of insects, not only in terms of diversity or species, but just how many. Half of all the named animal species are insects at any one time. Like the other day I showed you, 10 to the 18 are alive. There's a boatload of insects out there. 3 body regions. They have a head. That thorax should be over to the left. That indentation is wrong. The head and the thorax should be, well, actually the head and the 3 regions are the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. I'm sorry, kind of the way so the head ought to be pushed over and indented. The thorax has 3 segments, 2 legs per segment, sometimes a pair or 2 of wings. Now, wings, folks, are not modified appendages. I said everything about arthropods is all about the modified appendages. You might think of a wing that's an appendage as being a modified appendage like the legs and the mouth-feeding parts, but it's not. It's an outgrowth of the body wall. So it's not technically an appendage. Made of chitin, made of protein, strong but light. And this was these wings that really led to the radiation of insects during the Carboniferous. Remember, the Carboniferous period was when plants were starting to move out onto land. And one of the things that helped was the mycorrhizae that we talked about, but also these pollinating insects could help disperse them. And that would have been very popular or very important in the Carboniferous. Most of these guys have compound eyes, so that means that they see the world very good in terms of motion, but not so good with detail like we talked. Mouth parts of all insects are similar, except they've been modified. Like, for example, if you look on the right, the mosquito's mouth parts have been modified for piercing. The butterfly, who feeds on nectar, has a long, curled up one that they can use to get the nectar. And sopping, flies sop their food. So when that fly lands on your burger, what he's doing, what you mean by sopping, is basically they lick your food. Like if you took a piece of bread and sopped up that gravy in the bottom of the bowl, flies are actually, and what they do is they actually spit up a little saliva onto your food to start the digestion process, and then they sop up that food that they had just spit up on. So you think about that next time you shoo that fly off. And by the time you see the fly on your food and you shoot him off, he's already dribbled on your food. So if that kind of stuff bothers you, that should be an interesting thing to think about. Excretory system for insects, being that they're terrestrial, it's going to be Malpighian tubules. Those that are flying insects, the winged insects, the trachea in many cases have been expanded into air sacs. It's very similar to the hollow bones in birds. Flying birds have hollow bones because it lightens the load. So the air sacs lighten the overall mass of the body of the insect, making it easier for it to fly. As far as sensory, they have setae, and I know it's spelled the same way as the chaetae that we were talking about when we were looking at the worms. But in this case, the setae are these little hair-like structures that you see down here. Now, only mammals have real hair, so it's not really hair, but they can detect chemical, mechanical, and sound signals with those. Some insects, like the grasshopper, see that white arrow there? It's pointing to something called the tympanum. And the tympanum is a thin membrane that covers over the top of a tracheal air sac. So when sound and vibrates, that sound is then reverberated down through the tracheal air sac. So it's a way for them to sense how precise can they detect the sound in terms of, the differences in sound. It's probably not all that great. It's probably like their eyes, but enough, of course, for them for survival. Insects very often have pheromones. Nearly all of them do, which they use for communication, like mating signals. And then you see the ants crawling there. Ants. You ever had ants crawling in your house and you killed them? You stepped all over them. Maybe you sprayed them with bug spray. You might find a little bit later on they're coming back over the same path exactly. Good God, what I got to do here? The reason why they're using the same path is the ants from before were dropping little chemical scent markers, like the Hansel and Gretel dropping the bread, so they knew where the path was. And those little chemical markers are pheromones. It's something that communicates. The way to get rid of that is you kill the ants, and then you use like a heavy cleaner, like bleach or something, to clean that area so that you don't. So they don't keep coming back to the same place. The reason why I have the mosquito larvae down there is the trachea. In a mosquito larvae, part of the trachea extends up here to the surface, and this is where they get their air. So we're below the water surface here, and there's an opening, and mosquito larvae can actually exchange gases through that little tube that's connected to the top, which is part of its tracheal system. Put oil on the water, and it suffocates the mosquito larvae because it plugs up that little air hole. Putting oil on water is not a good idea, by the way. It may kill the insects, but it causes all kinds of other damage. Life histories. Most of them engage in sexual reproduction, internal fertilization. Again, shouldn't be surprising. These are terrestrial critters, and internal fertilization is pretty much the norm among terrestrial organisms. Many undergo metamorphosis. They undergo changes, and that can be of two types, incomplete or complete. Incomplete metamorphosis, the organisms on the left, these are incomplete. Nymphs are larval stages of insects, another name for them. In incomplete metamorphosis, the young look like the adult, they're just smaller. In complete metamorphosis, that's like the butterfly, right? You have the egg, the caterpillar, then it goes into a pupa, and then comes out it as a butterfly. Totally different looking organism. That's complete metamorphosis. Complete metamorphosis is actually a very important evolutionary innovation in terms of ecosystems, because in complete metamorphosis, you can have organisms of the same species, but in two different life stages who consume different resources. So the caterpillar and the butterfly can live together in the same area and not have to worry about competing for resources. So it's kind of like when I was saying dispersing your young so you don't compete. Another way you could do that if your young eat something different than you. Of course, when they become adults, then they'll have to move away. But we think that through evolutionary time, perhaps that's why complete metamorphosis evolved, because of the different resources that each eat or use. Now, as I said, there are over 30 orders of insects. We're not going to go over all of the orders, but I do want to point out a few of them. One of the ones that we looked at, the Zygentoma, which are the silverfish. That's kind of interesting. Silverfish are sort of an ancient group that haven't changed much since the dinosaur era. And there's 450 species. All of them together are called silverfish. You find plenty of silverfish in libraries. They're always around books. Go over to the library here on campus, there's silverfish. Among the winged insects down below, I've separated in the picture here between those that undergo complete and those that undergo incomplete metamorphosis. And then in each one, I've given you a little hint as to what type of insect we're talking about. Like, for example, that first one here, this is the male snout weevil, and he's a Coleoptera. There we go, about 350,000 species. Isn't he a cool looking critter, isn't he? About 350,000 species of those guys. Now, the coleo part is from the Latin or the Greek or whatever, coleus, which means sheathed. So coleopterid beetles have two sets of wings, one that are non-flying, okay, these, and then underneath it are the flying wings. So if you've ever seen like a June bug take to flight, they'll open up the sheathed part, right, and then the wings are underneath that, and they can fly off that way. Diptera, like the flies. Oh boy, of course, our buddy, the mosquito. That's a Diptera. Diptera, Di means two, and Dipterans have two wings. They only have two wings only. Hymenoptera, the bees. Hymenoptera, a hymen is the thin piece of tissue that a female mammal is torn or lost, typically during the first sexual intercourse. So hymen refers to a thin piece of tissue. The wings of bees wasps and their relatives are very thin, so that's where the word Hymenoptera comes from. And I always remember Hymenoptera as the bees because I remember hymen. Hymen is vagina, sex, birds and the bees. A little bit of associative thinking there, right? There's a hawk moth down here. Look at that. That thing huge. Lepidoptera are the butterflies and the moths. They have scaly wings. Among the ones that undergo incomplete metamorphosis, we have the Hemiptera, which have, hemi means half. They don't have half a wing, but what they mean is they have two types of wings. They have wings that are textured, and then they have wings that are not textured. And that last thing there, really cool looking critter, is a katydid. They have very straight wings, so ortho or orthodox. I like his feet on this guy. He's just a cool looking little insect. There's a Hymenoptera. Hummingbird hawk moth. About the size of a small bird, but it's actually a moth. And the Hemiptera, obviously with the collection of young. And then the katydids. Everybody loves katydids. Look at this. Isn't that a weird looking critter? This is the spear bearer katydid. You might have. We have katydids in Florida. Is that what you're talking about, the katydid that you've seen? What do you think the little projections on the legs are for? Or actually all over? Oh, yeah, the hummingbird hawk moth. Yeah, Dustin, that's right, protection. Yeah, a student in the other class actually got one from their field notebook, so yeah, they're around. Now, three other groups that I want to go over before we leave the arthropods completely. The dragonflies, I can't go on without talking about the dragonflies, my favorite insect. Been around since the dinosaurs, pretty much have changed very little. They're a living fossil. The Odonata, they have teeth. So Odonata's teeth, like odontocetes or toothed whales or the guy who puts braces on you. Orthodontist, an orthodontist. Termites are Isoptera. Iso means equal. So in this case, they have two pairs of wings, although some are wingless, and the wings are equal in size. These are the termites. A lot of social organization in these organisms. And of course, we can't go without talking about fleas. Fleas are Siphonoptera. They have no wings, but they have a siphon. They have piercing mouth parts by which they extract blood from their host. So they're parasites. So we talked about human beings. If you think you've had parasites, anytime you've had a flea on you or a mosquito and any of that sort of stuff, you've been parasitized. Fleas sense carbon dioxide, by the way. That's how they know you're around. Higher levels of carbon dioxide indicate that there's some breathing critter around that they can perhaps parasitize. All right, so we worked our way all the way through all of the protostomes. These are all the protostomes. We're now going to turn our attention to the deuterostomes. You remember in embryonic development, they're the ones that it's the mouth that forms first and the anus forms second. So this is going to include our group. Now, we're not going to really talk about the hemichordates. We're going to talk about the echinoderms, these guys today, and then we'll leave the chordates for the last few lectures that we'll go over. So the deuterostomes include that rhinoceros. I think that's a white rhino, if I remember right. It's a pretty impressive looking critter. Sharks, sea stars, sea cucumbers, and humans. We're all in this group together. This is our closest invertebrate relatives, are the echinoderms. What's that horn made of on a rhino? Does anybody know? With a K. Hair, basically. It's a mass of hair, mass of keratin. Yeah. Why do people cut it off? Why are the horns of rhinos poached? What's the market, I guess? No, not ivory. That'd be the elephants. Yep, aphrodisiac. That's right. So we're basically, now when you cut the horn off of a rhino, a wild rhino, he ain't going to sit there still and let you do it. Presumably the idea then is if you are poaching rhino horns, you're killing the rhino. I can't think of too many things that I know about in life that are more wasteful than killing an animal like this to cut its horn off so somebody else can get horny. I find that obnoxious. And aphrodisiacs don't work, you know, and certainly a mass of ground up rhino horn is not going to be an aphrodisiac. Amazing to me how human beings can be so incredibly ignorant sometimes. All right, let's do the echinoderms. The spiny skin critters, okay? These are exclusively marine. There are no freshwater echinoderms. Pentaradial symmetry, radial symmetry typically in 5s, although that isn't a hard and fast rule. But as adults, and this is going to become interesting when we talk about the chordates, as adults, the larvae, as you see there on the right, this is the larvae, are actually bilateral. So bilateral symmetry as adults, or as larvae, that transforms into this radial or pentaradial symmetry when they get older. Nervous system is really a very simple ring with some radial branches. There's no cerebral ganglion, no brain. Therefore, we believe no higher thought process, obviously. They have an endoskeleton. They have an epidermis that covers over these plates of calcium carbonate, these plates being called ossicles. I got a picture in a couple of slides. I'll show you what these ossicles look like. But that is their form of a skeleton. And of course, this includes the sea stars, the brittle stars, which I don't have a picture of a brittle star here, but we'll see one in a minute. The sea urchins. The inside of a sea urchin, again, folks, is a test. All right, that's the shell. Sea biscuits, sand dollars, feather stars. Sometimes they're called sea pens because they kind of look like those old quills. And over here, this is a sea cucumber. It's all members of the group Echinodermata. Now, echinoderms are sort of interesting critters, and one of the things that's really fascinating about them is that all echinoderms, all members of the group Echinodermata, have this very unique system called a water vascular system. So that's unique to echinoderms. If we looked at a sea star on the top of a sea star, now the mouth of a sea star is below. So this is the mouth of the sea star. So that's the oral surface. The other side, where you're going to find this thing called the madreporite, that's on the side opposite the oral surface. That's the aboral surface. So on the aboral surface of sea stars, if you look closely, you'll see that there's one spot that looks a little bit different, and that's the madreporite. And it's basically a sieve that lets water through, which passes down through a stone canal. Stone canal because it's made up of calcium carbonate again, into a ring canal and out through radial canals. Now, this is a water vascular system. It doesn't carry blood, it carries water. What it does with the water in the water vascular system is it uses it to control its tube feet. You see those tube feet and the thing at the top, the ampulla? The ampulla is like the squeezy part at the top of a medicine dropper. So with this water vascular system, what echinoderms can do, if you take a look right here, they can move with these tube feet. So what they do is they'll force water down into one of those arms, and just like the mushrooms popping up from below, right? The water pressure pushing down causes those tube feet to extend. And many of those tube feet, not all of them, but many of the species have suckers on the end of them, so they can attach those tube feet and then pull themselves along. You can see down here a little bit closer picture of the tube feet attached to something. So they can actually use these ampulla, kind of like I was saying with the eyedropper. They squeeze them in, and that squeezes water out into the tube feet. You unsqueeze them, creates a vacuum, creates a little bit of a suction. Now, there's probably not a lot of suction on any one tube foot, but you get all these tube feet together, and what these sea stars can do is they can wrap themselves around a mollusk, like a bivalve, and they'll attach all these tube feet to them, and they just gently but incessantly keep pulling, and they're opening that shell. All they have to do is open it a little bit, because then they can invert their stomach out into the mantle cavity and digest that mollusk. So as I said, tube feet are good for movement. They're good for feeding. Oh, they're also good for gas exchange too. They're thin enough, highly vascularized, so you can exchange gases across your tube feet too. Here's what I mean about the endoskeleton up here. So the ossicle, that's that calcium carbonate plate. They have spines of calcium carbonate that stick out. That's for protection. They also have these lumps or bulbs, if you will, that stick out of the skin. These are called dermal branchia. Dermal branchia are gas exchange devices. Branchia means lung, basically. So it's, again, another one of those highly vascularized surfaces that can exchange gases that we've talked about. There's the madrepore here, you can see. Gonads and the digestive glands extend down through the radial arms along with the tube feet. The tube feet at the very end, the podium down there, actually, in order to stick on, they can use suction. In addition to that, and if those in those species that have it, there's actually an adhesive that the podium can secrete that sticks to whatever they're trying to stick to. And when they want to let go, then they can secrete these de-adhesive chemicals. Reproduction is mostly sexual. Asexual does occur. They can split. Usually males and females. Gametes are released into the water with free-living, free-swimming larvae. Now, regeneration of lost parts. If you cut the arm off of a sea star, that sea star can regenerate that arm. Okay, that's kind of interesting, especially when you think about an organism that's relatively closely related to us, because we can't do that. And there's even a species of sea star right here that if the arm is cut off, but as long as a little bit of that central disc of the sea star is there, you can grow a whole new sea star from it. Now, in most species, the arm's cut off, you have the central disc, you can grow another arm. But like what I'm saying, in this species, all you need is one arm and part of that little disc, that little central disc, and you'll grow a whole new sea star from that. Down below is a sea cucumber. Sea cucumbers, to defend themselves, what they can do is they liquefy their internal organs, and then they spew them out through their mouths with the idea of dissuading the predator. That white stuff coming out, it's kind of like silly string. It's kind of sticky and messy. So predators are more inclined to go, oh, leave that alone. Now, sea cucumber doesn't die. Once it's liquefied and got rid of the predator, it then regenerates its internal organs. So it's not surprising considering these organisms can regenerate body parts too. From a human point of view, right, from our point of view, medically speaking, that's very interesting. Remember, again, I said that of all the invertebrates, the echinoderms are most closely related to us chordates. Now, that's a relative term, most closely related. But if we could figure out how something that's relatively closely related to us can regenerate body parts, you could just imagine the medical implications of that, right? Mess up your liver, grow another one. Mess up your lungs, grow another one. Always makes me wonder if people would be as health conscious if that were available. Would people, not drink or smoke if they thought, well, what difference does it make? I can always replace those parts that are ruined later on. Maybe we'll eventually live in a world like that where you can just exchange parts. I got a few parts that I'd trade in at this age, so maybe that's not a bad idea. Okay, let's look at the 5 classes of echinoderms. There's the asteroidea, or the sea stars, or the sea daisies. Sea daisies are really cool. There's only 3 species of them known. Very small. This is a sea daisy. And in 1986, check this out. This is so cool. They discovered Xyloplax janidae. They discovered that sea daisy there. Now, to this day, the only place they have found this organism living is on the decomposing wood of old ships that have sank in the ocean. Sort of asks, begs the question, what did they do before there were human beings making ships going out on the ocean? Well, trees and stuff fall into the ocean, so maybe that's how they survived. But it makes you kind of wonder if maybe the sea daisy population has increased a little bit on the ocean floor because of all the number of wooden ships that have sank throughout the years. Echinoderms, especially sea stars, are very often a keystone species. Remember I said a keystone species in an ecosystem is the species that the addition Well, I think I told you it was the removal that would cause the most change, but it can also be the addition. It's whatever species that's added or removed that causes the biggest change to occur. This is the crown of thorns sea star, and it's an introduced keystone species. And introduced into an environment, it causes all kinds of damage and destruction. So that's just one species. So that's what I mean, keystone. Keystone is that one species that has the biggest effect. Now, among the Asteroidea, the central disk of it is not sharply demarcated, and the arms have an obvious taper. So what we mean by the disk is not sharply demarcated is the middle disk kind of blends into the arms. And you'll see in the brittle stars in the next a very big difference from that. Most of them have arms of 5 or multiples, but not all of them. That one there that and the guy's holding in his hand is 8 arms. All right, so sharp disc, not sharply demarcated, obvious arm length taper. Let's take a look at the brittle stars. Brittle stars, very definitive disc, and the arms have very little taper. The only place they taper really is at the end. That's brittle stars. Now, brittle stars are called brittle stars because they are brittle, if you will. Brittle stars are very apt to autonomize their arms, especially under predator duress. See in the bottom there, Amphiodia urtica, with its 2 arms missing? That's predator duress. Again, a predator is harassing it. I'm going to give up an arm that's going to wiggle around. Hopefully the predator is kind of like the tail of a lizard. The predator goes, oh, what's this over here? And then hopefully you get away. They have tube feet, but they don't have suction cups. So they're used for crawling or more like thrashing around. You see this one's on land. They don't move very gracefully. They're more like just kind of thrashing around. But the tube feet kind of work like the seedy in the worms. They give them a little bit of a traction so they can move. The picture behind all of these pictures is a bunch of sea stars at the bottom of the ocean. Brittle stars at the bottom of the ocean. They're very, very common down there. This is a Florida sea star. A lot of times people put sea stars in their aquariums and then you never see them again because they usually hang up under the rocks and only come out at night for the most part. Ooh, the Echinoidea, the sea urchins, the sand dollars, and the sea biscuits. No arms, tube feet though. The tube feet are found in double rows. This is this test over here. So that's one row, one double row of tube feet. 2, 3, 4, and 5. You see a little bit more clear over there. So they do have the tube feet, and of course the spines, which are movable, good for defense. Now, if you've ever taken a sand dollar or a sea biscuit and you shake it, you can hear there's something inside. If you carefully have broke one open, you notice, oh, it's a little star inside. Well, what that little star is something called Aristotle's lantern. Aristotle's lantern is called that because Aristotle was the first one to describe it. Here's actually his drawing of it. And it's the neatest little feeding mechanism. If you flipped a sea urchin over or a sand dollar and you looked at its mouth, you would see these little tiny teeth sticking out. So that's the bottom side. Those teeth are those teeth right there, okay? Now take a look at how the Aristotle's lantern is arranged. There's the esophagus. It's got these calcareous plates around it with these protractor and retractor muscles. So what happens is the protractor muscle that we see here and the retractor muscle are going to cause, let's see if I can do it with my hands. Here's one of those calcareous plates. Say it's maybe this one. And then the teeth is right below it. So what those muscles do is they cause that calcareous plate to move back and forth, and when it does, it pivots the teeth. So it causes the teeth, now this is the teeth hand, so the teeth are closing, opening, closing, opening. So this thing moves along and nips. It's a grazer. Nobody else has got an Aristotle's lantern. That's just I mean, look at that. That's just a cool design of a feeding mechanism. Wish I could draw like Aristotle. Incredible. But we know it's not a scale of nature. All right, the Crinoidea, the sea lilies, the feather stars, the sea pens, they're sometimes called. These are living fossils. Remember what I said that? Living fossils, organisms that, you know, they look like things from the past or have changed very little. These guys have changed very little since the Cambrian, 500 million years ago. Dioecious, free-swimming larvae, a sessile juvenile, which then develops into a sessile adult among sea lilies. Among feather stars, the sessile juvenile, it's a free-swimming larvae, a sessile juvenile, and then a free-moving adult in these feather stars. They're suspension feeders. Their arms are being used just like, the cilia and the rotifer and the barnacle and its appendages to capture food. But they do have a U-shaped gut, so that means their mouth and their anus, everything faces up, are right next to one another. Feather stars can actually move. This is a feather star crawling out on land. Look at that. Imagine seeing something like that. Not a spider. It's related to sea stars. Isn't that weird? You can see why sometimes they're called sea pens too. Like I was saying, the old quills that they use, they look a lot like that. And the last group are the Holothuroidea, or the sea cucumbers. These are very often deep ocean organisms. A reduced endoskeleton, they're very soft and spongy. The oral tube feet have been modified into feeding tentacles. They're right there. Those are feeding tentacles. You can even see some tube feet on this sea cucumber here as well. And these aren't predators or carnivorous. They're detritivores, so they feed on that decaying material that you might find at the bottom of the ocean. You can breathe through their anus using a respiratory tree. And a respiratory tree, folks, is again a piece of tissue or an area of tissue that's highly vascularized. The tree idea is that all the blood vessels are making the branches of the tree. So you have all these blood vessels and you have this thin tissue, and you can exchange gases across it. And we eat sea cucumbers. This is a dish. I've never eaten a sea cucumber. I wonder what it tastes like. There's another one spewing out its internal organs. It reminds me when I was diving in the Philippines with a friend of mine one time, we found a sea cucumber. So being obnoxious humans that we are, we decided, oh, it's like a football. So we were throwing it back and forth like it was a football. My buddy was throwing it to me, and about halfway, all this white stuff comes shooting out of it. Well, it's long before I went to college. I didn't know what it was, and it's kind of sticky. And I thought, oh my God, what has happened to me? But it did exactly what it was supposed to do. It made us leave them alone. That's for sure. It's very bizarre. And then it regenerates them. Oh, wonderful. Well, folks, that's pretty much it for everything but the chordates. That's all of chapter 34 or chapter 33. We'll get into chapter 34 when we start next week, where we'll talk about all the different types of chordates, and that'll be the chapter that will go on through till the end of the semester. So it's the last one. All right, folks, that's all I have for today. If you have any questions, by all means, please ask me them. If not, y'all have a good weekend. Remember, next week we will meet for class on Tuesday. But we don't have class on Thursday, and we are doing our Shark Lab on Tuesday. You don't want to miss that. That's always a lot of fun. All right.